Chapter 11, A Thing or Two. The mess in the dining hall seemed to take forever to clean up. It didn't help when Addie had to leave to pull dinners together for the cutting crew. After the last pancake was unstuck from the wall, the last tin mug was found outdoors. Gus went into the kitchen to see if Alex had returned. Gus couldn't see him anywhere. He knew Addie would need help with getting the baskets and boxes filled into the wagon. Gus helped Addie as they stirred the pots of stew and piled loaves of bread into baskets and packed cans of tomatoes into boxes. They were just about finished when Addie mentioned that she could hear the clanking of Tommy's wagon coming from the barn. "You better start getting the baskets around and pile the boxes by the door. Tommy will be needing your help today." Gus was glad. After the morning, he had needed a chance to get away for a while. Tommy pulled Dick and Jim around to the back door of the cook shack, and Gus started loading the baskets and the boxes into the wagon. "Hold up there, boy," called Tommy. "Today, Addie generally makes stew for the men. Those stew pots have to go in first. Then we pack the boxes and the baskets around it and keep it warm and hold them steady. Come here and take hold of the reins. Talk real sweet to Dick and Jim, and they'll hold real still for you. I'll go help Addie with the big pots." Tommy disappeared into the cook shack and soon returned carrying a huge steaming pot of stew. "How them boys doing for you, Gus?" asked Tommy. "They're just fine, just fine," Gus said as he looked at the big horse that reached out and gave Jim a pat, and Dick, who was getting restless, started pawing at the ground with his hoof. "Steady, boy, steady. It's all right. Tommy will be right back," and Gus gently held tight to his reins. Tommy, who had gone back into the cook shack, returned with the second pot of stew and slid it onto the wagon bed. "There you go, boy," said Tommy as he came around to the wagon, taking the reins from Gus's hands. "You work well with the horses, boy, and they seem to like you just fine. Maybe I could get the push to allow you to come work with me away from Alex." "Oh, is that right?" came a booming voice from the other side of the wagon. It was the push. "I thought this here boy was supposed to be leaving camp at the end of the week, Tommy." "You know, boy," said the push to Gus, "I've been thinking, since your friend Tommy here is so concerned about you paying back your bill at the company, I thought I would help him out by giving you another job to do. This way, it will help you pay your credit up even quicker. Tonight, before you hit the bunk, I want you to black grease my good boots. Alex's too, you know, and then you pay a lot of money for something like good fitting boots. You should take care of them. My boots need a thorough getting over, and so do Alex's before you hit the hay tonight. I want the job done." Gus's face reddened, and he bit down hard on his lip, trying to keep from saying anything. "You got a problem with that, boy?" asked the push. "No, sir," replied Gus. Good. I'll make sure you get the boots when you're finished with the cook shack tonight. You know, I think this was one of Alex's better ideas. The boy's bound to make a great push someday," he said with pride. Tommy knew better than to say anything, and he gave Gus a look to keep quiet, too. "By the way, Tommy, I ran across Alex, and he said he would be here to make the dinner run with you, so make sure you wait for the boy." "Oh," said Tommy, "I thought I would take Gus here since he's right here, and besides, Alex should get out of the camp a bit till the men cool down." "You want to take Gus out in the woods with all those hungry jacks who could finish their breakfast this morning because of him? I don't think it's a good idea, Tommy. You just wait up for Alex." Gus stood staring. "I don't believe this," he thought. "Alex caused the trouble, and I get all the blame." Just then, Alex came sauntering across the yard with a smug look on his face. "Hey, Gus, did I tell you your flappers went over great this morning? You read recipes real good." Gus was so mad he could have punched Alex right then and there, but Gus now understands why Alex had put salt and sugar in the sugar bowls. He was getting back at him because he could read. Addie came out of the cook shack and called to the men, "Tommy, you better get going. It's getting late." Alex jumped in the back of the wagon, and Addie gave him a dirty look. "I thought you probably applied for a job as the boss since you're doing proper kitchen work is too hard for you." "Addie," snapped the push, "you best tend to your own knitting, or you'll be cooking elsewhere." Gus pushed past Addie into the kitchen. He opened the stove door and dropped into a fresh log, watching the sparks fly up and dance into the air. "It's not fair, boy, that you got the dirty end of the stick this time because of that poorly bred youngin'," said Addie. "You're a good boy, Gus. And don't go forgetting it. That boy will get his due someday, and the price he pays will be high. Gus looked at Addie. He knew she liked him and was on his side, and that was all that really mattered. Gus helped serve the lunch for a few men that stayed in at the camp. Some refused to take black lead from Gus. Others commented, "I hope you're not planning on sleeping in the bunkhouse tonight, boy." When supper time came, Addie and Gus worked in the kitchen, putting out food bowls into bowls and slicing bread and cutting pies. She and Alex served the coffee and the work in the dining room. Addie understood that it wouldn't take much for the men to explode into another fight. If that happened, maybe this time it would mean her job too. After supper, Gus and Alex washed the dishes together, but never said a word to each other. When they finished, Alex sat down, pulled off his stinky boots, and handed them to Gus. "These are for you. Pa's boots are over by the door with a tin of boot grease. They'll be wet. They'll be writing on the side of the tin. I'm sure you can read how to grease them up just right." Alex gave Gus a rat grin. Gus wanted to shove his boots into Alex's face. "Excuse me, boys," interrupted Addie. "The work is done in the kitchen. Gus, you better get yourself to the bunkhouse. Alex, I'm finished with you also, so good night." Addie put her hands on her hips and stood watching the boys as they left the dining hall in the opposite directions, making sure the two of them didn't start a fight. Gus carried the boots in his arm's length because they smelled so bad. The tin of grease had an old rag wrapped around it, and it was filthy and smelly too. On his way to the bunkhouse, Gus walked the path of the outhouse, looking out of the outhouse door to make sure there was no one around. Gus dangled the boots over one of the holes of the outhouse. It would serve them right, he laughed. Then he stopped himself, knowing that he was already in enough trouble. When Gus entered the bunkhouse, all the men were real quiet and stared at Gus. Tommy came from the back of the room, put his arm around him, and escorted him through the men to his bunk. The men started talking quietly among themselves, and a fellow by the pot-belly stove called out, "Hey, boys, I just got myself a new Paul Bunyan story published here in the Gazette. Who wants to read it? You want me to read it to you?" Suddenly, the room was full of noise, and the men all chimed in. "All right, a new story." Gus smiled at the men, thinking about how excited they were to have a simple story read to them. Gus sat down on the deacon's bench in the front of the bunk and read the slide of the grease tin and how to grease the boots. Most of the men were gathered around the stove, while the Jack who was going to read it sat in the Moonshine's checker chair and prepared himself. Even Rat Hole Andy flopped down beside the stove and made himself comfortable, pulling out a plug of tobacco and chewing it while he made it ready to listen. Gus pried open the grease tin and began polishing the push's boots with the old rag. The man with the newspaper cleared his throat and began to read. "Paul Bunyan, there once were a lumber camp. The nearest town were 30 miles away." "Shucks, fella, sounds like us," the reader commented, as the men agreed. "The nearest neighbor are Fox and Bars, who, I don't know this word, is spelled Prowl. Prowl, said Gus. "The word is prowl." All the men turned and stared at Gus as if they couldn't believe their ears. Old Moonshine Jay, who was chewing on the end of the pipe of smoke, spoke up. "You read, boy?" "Sure I read." The lumberjacks all looked at one another and started to laugh. "You better get this over here, this mangy excuse for a reader," asked Moonshine. "Yes, I read pretty well. I like to read," said Gus. The men started talking amongst themselves, and Rat Hole Andy spoke up. "Hey, boy, I'll grease those boots for you if you'll read the story to us." The men all thought that this was a great idea. Rat Hole stood up and spit out a mouthful of juice and spit in the can and took the newspaper from his owner. Without protest, the owner handed over the paper. Everyone moved in with their chairs closer so that Gus and Rat Hole took the grease and the boots and sat on the floor waiting to hear the story. Paul Bunyan. "Do you know this is actually called an American folk tale? Actually, it's a tall tale. I learned that in school." The men raised their eyebrows. Big words nodded their heads in the boy's superior knowledge. "This is a lumbering camp, the nearest town is 30 miles away. The nearest neighbors are looking for foxes and bears who prowl behind the cook shanty and at the night and the night owl swooping swiftly across the face of the moon. All they needed to add is the growl of the cougar and Napoleon, and the writer would be describing our camp, said Gus. The men sat there surprised at the great talent this boy possessed. Over here is the bunkhouse. Inside, big, tired men sprawled across their bunks. Gus continued to read the whole story to the men, never missing a word or stumbling over any punctuation. Boy, said the moonshine when Gus had finished. Boy, I ain't never heard such sweet reading in all my born days, except that is, when my dear old mama used to read to me from the good book. Ma always would tell us youngins how important it was to learn to read. Of course, we had no teachers around, and Ma did her best with us boys, but Pa always needed us to work in the fields clearing the land, and there was always a stream full of fishing waiting to be caught. It's the only thing in my old age I've ever regretted not being able to read. So I could read a weekly gazette and the good book like my ma. Rat Hole stood up and showed Gus the great job he had done greasing the boots. You know, boy, this morning I could have chewed you up and spit you out for what you done in that dining hall, but anyone who possesses talent for reading like you can be forgived for causing trouble, right, boys? The men agreed. But I didn't do anything, insisted Gus. The men started to grumble among themselves. It was Alex. He was mad because I could read Addie's recipe in the book and he couldn't. He did it to get me in trouble, to get me kicked out of camp. You gotta believe me. The men listened to the serious looks on their faces. You mean, boy, you are losing your job because of that spoil rotten good-for-nothing pain in the... Yep, we got the pictures. We got the picture, Rat Hole, interrupted Tommy. Tommy came over and stood beside Gus, and the men listened carefully. There's not a thing we can do about it, boys. The trouble's happened. The boss has put down the law. Gus will be leaving the camp on the next wagon out. It's best to leave things alone. We don't want the boy to get kicked out of camp before the wagon comes because of some silly prank, do we? The men agreed. 'Tain't right, though. This here boy has to leave camp because of that brat. That Alex should be taught a thing or two, said Andy. Just then, the metal ting rang through the camp, and the push voice echoed through the woods. 9 o'clock! Douse those lights out!